Hi, I'm Anthony Newbold. Welcome to A Closer Look. My guest this week is the Executive Director of the Government and Public Policy Institute at the University of Bahamas, former Cabinet Minister, Mr. Zhivargo Laing. Mr. Laing, welcome to the show.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
We're talking about public policy today. I don't know that a lot of Bahamians pay too much attention to the creation of public policy in its raw form. We say we're creating public policy. And I'm thinking that may be because they're not aware of the role that public policy plays in our life, or just because it's not clearly laid out that public policy is being created. Is that a fair assessment?
Well, I will tell you this much. Most people have been impacted by public policy, have reacted to public policy, have concerns about public policy, have driven public policy, but never really called it public policy in that formal term. So whenever you have an issue in your country, an issue in your community, and the government is responding or not responding to it, all of that is public policy. Every law passed, every regulation passed, every procedure that the government implements, they all reflect public policy. So we've all been caught up, responded to, reacted to, and been impacted by public policy, but may not have seen it in the formal context or definition of public policy.
How important is it for us, Bahamian citizens, to understand that? And how much of an impetus was it in the creation of the Institute?
Well, it's very important, and it is the reason the University of the Bahamas decided to have an institute dedicated to public policy, because quite frankly, public policy gets in your bedroom, gets in your business, gets in your schooling, gets even in your burial, gets in your marriage. Public policy is pervasive. As long as you live in a territory or a state that has a government, public policy you are immersed in public policy.
Public policy is it's the basis on which governments operate.
It is everything to do with the government's actions or reactions to matters related to the people in the country. Everything from healthcare to national security to education to social policy to economic policy, cultural policy, youth policy. Everything the government does or does not do is a matter of public policy.
You're at the University of the Bahamas, and somebody say the university is supposed to be the crucible for innovative and life-changing initiatives. Your institute should be a critical part of that. How much does it help that the institute is actually in that environment at the university?
It's critical, because here is why it's there, Brother Newbold. Whenever we have discussions about public policy, what the government is or is not doing, what issues the public is or is not contending with, we can come at those issues from a perspective of prisms. I'm an Anglican, I'm a Baptist, I'm white, I'm black, I am F&M, I'm PLP, I'm rich, I'm poor, I'm over the hill, I'm under the hill, I'm in front of the hill. So those are our prisms we can come at them with. Or we can come at them with our passions. I care, I don't care, I care a lot. I really care. It's very emotional. What the university seeks to do is to say, I'm not entering the discussion about public policy from a prism or passion perspective. I'm doing so from the perspective of research. I'm doing so from the perspective of reasoning. And so our responsibility is to inject into the public discussion, inject into the public policy dialogue, inject into the public policy design a research, evidence-based perspective. one that allows people to have a kind of a fair arbiter, impartial arbiter in the dialogue.
You at the university, how involved in what you do has been the youngsters there at the university, young people in general?
Well, firstly, let me say that the Institute is very young, okay? It existed primarily in concept for a couple of years. I have been there now for about 2.5 years. My responsibility is to develop this institute, okay? And so it's just starting up, but young people have an opportunity to be commentators on public policy matters, as we have hosted uh, dialogues with them. They can be participants in public policy uh, research friendships. And I have to tell you that a fair number of my staff are fairly young people too. Very highly trained, but they are also fairly young.
Okay, we're going to talk some more about your primary focus, but we got to take a break, and we'll be back with more with the Executive Director of the Government Public Policy Institute at the University of Bahamas, Mr. Zhivargo Laing, after this. Welcome back to A Closer Look. I'm Anthony Newbold speaking with Mr. Zhivargo Laing. He's a former cabinet minister, and he's the executive director of the Government and Public Policy Institute at the University of the Bahamas. Mr. Laing, if you had to summarize, focus, what is the primary focus of your institute as far as you're concerned?
Well, it's not so much as far as I'm concerned that the Institute has an actual mandate, a written mandate, and the mandate is fourfold. We are to engage public policy dialogue. So we're supposed to create opportunities for there to be discussions on matters of public policy. So you will see we host lectures. So we've had lectures involving all the former governors of the central bank. We've had lectures by the Minister of Health. We have international guests who come and give us policy perspectives internationally. We host radio dialogue. We host policy in the park. So dialogue, promoting public policy dialogue is our first mandate. The second mandate we have is public policy research. We are to engage in research related to matters of public policy. So whether that's in the immigration sphere, the economic sphere, for instance, the natural resources issue, our job is to bring research to bear on those matters of public policy. Thirdly, we are responsible for providing advisory and consulting services to both the public and private sector on matters of public policy. So to the extent the government wishes to have some guidance on a matter, they can contract the Government and Public Policy Institute to do that, and they have done so. If the private sector wanted to some consulting done on matters of public policy, they can contract the Government and Public Policy Institute to do that. And then fourthly, we are to provide training in the area of public policy. So we can train government officers, we can train private citizens about policy. What is it? How do you design it? How do you execute it? And so forth. So those are the four pillars of our responsibilities at the Institute.
You mentioned the government, of course. That's the first word in your name. Some people may have the view that the government is more often than not, is like some sort of echo chamber. And any advice coming to it, whether it's good or bad, because it's coming from outside the government, it may be looked at skeptically. What has been the level of receptiveness? Your new institute is young, between you and the government.
Well, firstly, let me say to people that we have no relationship with the government to the extent that the government doesn't fund us. The government is not it's not the mandate that we doesn't give the mandate that we have. So we are an independent entity. We have academic integrity as our guide, so that an independence, autonomy. We don't, what we say, what we research, and what we produce is independent of the government, and doesn't take account of whether the government likes or does not like it. We haven't had we have had a responsiveness from the government to our being available. And so we are now contracted to do about 3 projects for the government and working on another project for the government. So there's been a responsiveness to our ability to be helpful in terms of advice, guidance, and information and research.
Talking about projects you engaged in for the government, we've had 2 major events that have had seismic implications and impact on this country. We've had Dorian, and now we're in the midst of COVID, so we're not sitting next to each other. Is that part of what you engaged in with the government, to determine what kind of policy the government is going to affect with response to those 2 events?
Well, in respect of those 2 issues, the government did not solicit any response from us, but we gave responses, right? And so that with respect to Dorian, for instance, we engaged a partnership with the University of Miami on a study of business resiliency. How can businesses be more resilient in the face of these kinds of things? And so that study is in its last stages of completion. We also engaged a policy survey to see the extent to which the government's policy matches with international best practices, and where might be the gaps, and where might be the efficiencies that we achieved in executing during Dorian. In respect of COVID, it wasn't solicited, but we offered a reopening framework for the government. Okay, so we produced a document, a report that said to the government, here is a strategic framework for considering the reopening of the economy. Was that used in the government's process? We really couldn't say one way or the other, but it was provided.
We started this talking about the public's understanding of the creation of public policy, and the fact that there may be a knowledge gap in understanding public policy. What do you do about that to make sure that knowledge gap isn't there? Because that will determine, to some degree, the success in whatever initiatives you engage in, your surveys, et cetera, et cetera.
Well, that's the job. That's the part of the job. That's why I'm doing this interview as an example. That's why we take occasion on in other media to advise people, to share with people what we're doing. That's why we bring all of our lectures to the public sphere, so that we can be a part of that process, and why we will have seminars and courses offered that can help people who want to go deeper in understanding public policy to do so. This is the way to do it. We have to use the media to get the word out and to get as many people as informed about it as we can. We had on, I host a show, and we had an entire Public Policy 101 on that show. And so it was done both on the show and by way of Zoom. And so we spend the entire time taking people through the fundamentals of public policy.
Any public policy, any policy adopted by a government, what are those factors you would say are critical to the success of any policy position that a government adopts?
Interestingly, let me say that taking an action by the government can be policy. Taking no action can also be policy. Okay? So when the government does something about a thing, it could be a policy. When the government doesn't do something about a thing, it could also be policy. So policy starts, first of all, with an assessment of the problem. The public says this community's roads are too dark. People are getting in accidents. People run the risk of being robbed or raped. So there's a community problem. So it begins with either the community agitating or some representative or some government entity observing that that is a problem. And then there is an assessment of the extent of the problem. Is this really a problem requiring the time, attention, and resources of the government? If the government makes the determination that it's a worthy cause for attention, now there has to be a development of strategies to address the problem. Because it may be in the first instance a simple matter to people that, okay, let's just put the lights on the road because people are saying it's too dark. But it may be that you put a light in the road that's shining directly into somebody's house, and they don't want that. So now you have to take account of all the pros and cons, you have to weigh all the implications of any set of options you have. And then you want to make a determination as to what, based on consultation, based on research, what is the best option. Doesn't mean what's the one everybody's gonna like. It's what's the best option, given all the options on the table. And then it's a question of executing, having chosen that option, so that you can deliver up the result that the option is supposed to deliver up for that community. And then when done, you want to evaluate it over time to see if adjustments need to be made, because from time to time, that too could be necessary.
And so implementing, executing public policy requires a whole lot of competencies across the board.
Absolutely. It requires, and it depends on the complexity of the problem. The more complex the problem, the more involved has to be experts from various fields to weigh in on the issue. Take the pandemic. It's not a simple issue. There are medical considerations, there are social considerations, there are economic considerations, there are infrastructural considerations. And so there is no one person or one set of persons who can effectively execute on that kind of policy scenario. You have to have a weighing in of multiple experts.
I want to talk some more about policy, obviously, but we got to take this final break, and we'll be back with more Mr. Zhivargo Laing after this. Welcome back. You're watching A Closer Look. I'm Anthony Newbold speaking with Mr. Zhivargo Laing. He's the Executive Director of the Government Public Policy Institute at the University of the Bahamas. Mr. Laing, we're talking about policy, again, obviously. Because the policy was introduced, it may not have worked. There's no reason why a similar policy, reworked, couldn't be reintroduced.
Well, you know, this is what is important for the citizen to understand about policy. You can't say that a policy is successful or unsuccessful unless you first ask and have answered the question, what was the aim? Yes. What was the objective? What was it that they were attempting to do? Sometimes what happens is a policy achieves an objective but has an unintended consequence. And so we get caught up in the unintended consequence. But in fact, the aim that it had was in fact achieved. You now have to ask the question, was the achievement of the aim undermined by the unintended consequence? So you have to always know what the objective is. So it is possible that a policy in its implementation may have been deficient and therefore the objective not achieved. So it's not a question of having a new policy, but examining the policy for where the deficiency took place and making adjustments, and then going to see if you get your result as on the basis of the adjustment.
Of course, policies, whatever they are, they would vary in the scope, size, time given to them for implementation. What's the cost of implementing public policy?
Okay, well, first of all, again, when we talk about policy, we are talking about what the government intends or is doing or not doing to respond to a public issue. Okay? Sometimes that can involve no cost at all. It can be someone says, you know what, you've had this law in place since 1904. It does nothing. It impacts nothing. So the government says, someone says you need to repeal it. And the government goes in the House of Assembly and repeals it. The cost is minimal to the government. But somebody says we need a bridge in Elusa repaired. Well, that's millions of dollars. So it all depends on the issue.
And which says the government does not always have to pay for a policy it decides to introduce.
Absolutely. Sometimes the government's policy is merely a decision that the citizens must cease to go a certain place because it's environmentally unsound. So the government merely passes a regulation based on laws in place and says, you are no longer permitted to go to this place because it's environmentally unsound. That doesn't have to cost the government anything. It now only requires compliance on the part of the citizens.
We also know that, you know, whatever a government does, whatever policy it decides to implement, everyone is not going to be happy with it.
All across the world, it is seldom the case that 100% happiness is achieved with any policy.
And so it's a matter of the greater good, as always.
It is. It is essentially a number of things. Because sometimes it's the greater good. Remember, it didn't say the majority, because some things government does, it does for a minority of citizens to protect their rights.
Yeah.
Okay? And so you can't, people like to think we need to have most people on buy-in. That's not true. Because if most people decide that you shouldn't be able to worship God how you want, you should only be able to worship God as an Anglican or Catholic or Seventh-day, then that doesn't protect the minority's religious right to religious expression. And so you can pass laws, you can have policy that impacts minorities. Why? Because justice and universal values are at play, and you want to advance those values.
And finally, with respect to your institute and public policy in general, in 10 years, I would like to see the Bahamian people finish it for me.
I'd like to see Bahamians fully conscious of the fact that public policy is not an accident, but a deliberate outcome of their own consciousness, advocacy, and willingness to put the work in to move public policy in the direction of sound, livable, sustainable results for themselves, and have institutions like the Government and Public Policy Institute as professional think tanks that can be applied rigorously to research to help support their thoughts and their ideas in respect to public policy.
In other words, in this democracy, it's you got to participate to make it work.
And participate intelligently. I can't stress that enough. It can't be that you just have a gut feeling. It can't be that you simply row and have emotional expressions about things or come at them from your particular vantage point. It has to be that you can take a reasonable and intelligent approach to it, even examining your own thinking to ensure that it is robust and can withstand scrutiny by whoever there is who may be scrutinizing it.
Thank you, Mr. Laing, and hopefully we'll have you back again. And thank you for watching A Closer Look. Remember, you can also see us on Facebook and on YouTube.